Hello, I'm Lisa, and this is the second of three videos I'm making around our minute repudiating the doctrine of discovery, and this video focuses on patterns. Patterns of diversity is a term I use from Yonu Span in studying with her through the Beyond Diversity 101 program. And patterns of diversity are the behaviors and ways of being that we all learn that work to maintain systems of oppression. They're patterns and behaviors that we learn from childhood that we're taught implicitly and explicitly in terms of this is how you're supposed to do this, and in all those silent messages we get as children about how we're supposed to show up and be. And they're how our society expects us to navigate difference and power. So whenever difference and power are present, it's what we're taught to expect to do. And so, for example, as a young girl, I was taught that to show respect when I went to my mother's church, when I went to my grandparents' house, I was supposed to have nicely brushed hair with bows. I should wear a skirt. There are all these ways I was told my physical body should be. Similarly, I got lots of messages growing up about who other groups of people were from the news, from media, from what I learned in my textbooks at school, from how my parents talked about people. And so we get all these ways of learning how to be growing up in all these different ways. And because these behaviors work to maintain the status quo, work to maintain systems of oppression, they are incredibly powerful in impacting all of our lives. But the thing that I find most exciting is that once we can identify them, we have greater capacity to interrupt them and to actually change them, because none of these ways of being are ways that are consistent with how God wants us to be in the world. And so we're going to look at some of them that come specifically from the doctrine of discovery and ways that they show up today. So there's three main ways that the doctrine of discovery sought to really control people. And in the previous video, I talked about some of the specific ways it does that. And I want to talk kind of more globally about some of the patterns. So the first is separation, that the patterns of settler colonialism, of domination, that come out of the doctrine of discovery are all about separating. And so the first is separating people from their bodies. And that means for the people in power, actually separating ourselves off cutting ourselves off at the neck. So it's all about intellectualizing stuff. It's all about how much we can rationalize or talk about things. And it's about denying and suppressing what we know with our bodies. And we see this very early on with the witch trials. We see this throughout Europe in the suppression of other ways of knowing and being in indigenous religions. And we see it very intensely throughout the history of the United States in how much we use physical violence to control different groups of people in our nation. It's also separation from the earth. So under the doctrine of discovery, the earth is a thing to be used and exploited, as opposed to creation that we have responsibility to tend and care for and are intimately a part of. It's separation from the rest of the human family, that the doctrine of discovery, in order to control the peoples of the Western Hemisphere and the other people who immigrated or were trafficked here, have to be seen as somehow less than and not fully human. And so it's separation of people from each other. It's also separation from what we know is right and true. The doctrine of discovery exists on a system of denial and lies, of truth, of rightness, of humanity. And so it has to tell all these lies. And that's part of separating ourselves up from our bodies, is that we can feel when something is wrong. We can feel when something is untrue. But if we just intellectualize the lie and cut off that other knowledge, then we can start to believe the lie. And so ultimately, all this is also separation from God, because none of this is in accordance with the vision that God holds for how we live on this earth or live in right relationship with other peoples. And so it's these deep levels of multiple separation. The second big pattern that comes out of the doctrine of discovery is this notion of domination and control. And so as the doctrine of discovery unfolds, and as European colonization of what's now the United States and the formation of the United States play out, there's all these ways that different identities have to get created as a way of maintaining power and control. So it starts with religion, Christian and non-Christian, and then it moves on to use gender, to use sex, to use class, to create race. as another way of dominating and controlling people. And each of these systems of dominating and controlling people is fundamentally about dehumanizing many groups of people to privilege one group of people, whether it's privileging men and dehumanizing women and genderqueer and transgender and gender nonconforming folks, whether it's privileging white people and dehumanizing indigenous people, African peoples, Asian peoples, Latinx peoples, multiracial peoples. It's also about assimilating all of these different groups into the mainstream, but assimilating where it's an either or. So that's where we see, particularly along race, you have to be this race or this race. We don't make a lot of space historically in contemporary US society for multiracial people to exist because it creates muddy lines, and that this domination control wants really clear-cut lines. And when it can't get those clear-cut lines to dominate and control, to push that separation, it wants to kill off and erase the group of people who might exist in a middle space. And we see that around race, we see that around gender identity and expression, we see that sometimes even in class, we see that around ability and disability and neurotypical issues and all sorts of different ways that people show up. And then the final pattern that is really strong that comes out of the doctrine of discovery is this right of exploitation. And that exploitation can be done for the dominance gain. So whoever is the dominant power structure gets to exploit people, resources, systems, communities in any way it wants for its own gain without thought to the long-term consequences. And that when a person or a resource is no longer of value, it can be executed. And we see this again over and over in many different systems of trafficked and enforced and enslaved labor, in the way the class system functions, a lot of times around gender and how that shows up in legalized relationships. And so it's a huge piece of how the doctrine of discovery has functioned and continues to function. So I want to break these down each a little bit more. So this notion of separation from our bodies, from the earth, from the human family, from what we know is right and true, and from God. Some of the ways that that pattern still shows up among friends today is this lie of the separation that supports all forms of oppression. And what I mean by that is the lies that says, I am somehow separate from this person because they are different from me in some way. And that at the core, that's a lie. Because I am you and you are me. And that's not promoting color blindness or an erasure of different lived experiences. Those are very real, but it's acknowledging that at our core, fundamentally, we are connected. And so different ways that we as friends still continue to see some people as other, whether they are not friends, whether they have different backgrounds from us, whatever it is, but it's that lie of separation. It's disembodiment that I remember as a child, I was really confused in what was happening in meeting for worship because we don't always talk about what we do with our young people, and it can look like a level of disembodiment, particularly if you're a wiggly little kid, you get told to be quiet and sit still, which is what gets told to us in school. And the way a lot of us interpret that is we have to cut this part of ourselves off and we have to control our bodies, as opposed to what's the invitation to be embodied and what are the ways that we can still our bodies, not as a way of controlling them, but actually as a way of opening up to what's going on internally. And so some of the different ways that Quakerism can lend itself to disembodiment, but also at its core, right? We're a really embodied religion. We actually quake with the spirit when we're worshiping in this very embodied way. The separation also shows up in environmental desecration and all the ways that those of us who live with a large carbon footprint continue to exploit the earth, even though we know that is not sustainable. It shows up whenever we have us-them thinking. And so if you think about some of the big business items we have coming before us this summer, it can be easy to fall into an us-them thinking versus a we thinking. And so how do we reclaim that connection in moving forward? And then the separation is also about making sure whoever is privileged in the system is feeling comfortable. And so if we think about some of the times when hard truths have been raised in our business meetings, in our faith communities, in our meetings at home, often we do things that kind of let the people who are most privileged remain comfortable without really diving into an issue that might be uncomfortable for some of us. And what I love about Quakerism and what I love that we have to offer ourselves in the world to counter these notions of separation is that at the core of our faith, the very center of it, is this notion that there's that of God, that of the divine, that of the Spirit in each one of us. And that means I can't believe that lie of separation, because for me to realize and honor God, I have to honor that of God in each person I encounter. And that separation has to break down. It means I can't be disembodied, because this body that I have is a manifestation of the divine just as much as your body is a manifestation of the divine. And so I have to honor all the ways that it shows up and all the information that I can access through my body when I'm fully connected and engaged with it. It means I cannot destroy the environment, because I understand that God created this world for us to live in and gave us enough resources to live in harmony with each other and creation. It means I can't engage in us them thinking and be truly faithful, because if there is that of God in the them and there is that of God in me, then my thinking, ultimately, the way I interact with us, has to be about bringing that together, because that's where I'm going to experience the fullness of God. And it can never be about comforting the privileged, because that we know when we comfort the privileged, more harm is done to those who are denied those privileges. And that means we are denying the reality and existence of God in those people, and that we are denying the humanity of those people. And so to live into God's vision for how we have to be, it's about stepping into that discomfort when we are the privileged. It is about demanding that our voices be heard when we are the ones being denied that privilege. And it's about that coming together. And so while these patterns of separation show up over and over again among friends, what we have to heal those patterns is so strong and so powerful. So this pattern of domination and control along all lines of identity, along dehumanization that seeks to assimilate, kill, or erase, again, this is a really powerful force in our culture, and so has crept into Quakerism. And some of the ways it shows up is in every form of oppression, right? Racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, ableism, ageism, all these different systems of oppression seek to control and dominate and dehumanize whole groups of people. And we see that showing up among Quakers. Often this notion of domination and control will conflate power with being right. And just as we see that tremendously right now in our nation, there's also ways among our Quaker community where sometimes those of us who have and claim power within our local meeting or our yearly meeting get to be right, sometimes at the expense of other people who may actually be right, and where we confuse power and right. Whenever we put process over people is a time when we are enacting domination and control. And so there are moments, again, in our business meetings and our way of doing things where we will put Quaker process sometimes ahead of people, or a distorted version of Quaker process over people. One of the ways that I see that most specifically showing up is that when things become charged or uncomfortable, again, particularly uncomfortable for the people who are most privileged within our society, someone will say, well, let's have some silence, not as a way to go deeper into the issue, but as a way to actually silence the issue. And I've seen that happen many, many times. Not always, and I'm not saying silence is bad at all. I think silence can be a tremendous place to really listen for what's going on and to connect with God and to see a path forward. But we sometimes do use silence to silence people. And that's part of a bigger pattern we have of conflict avoidance that stems from this notion of domination and control, that when conflicts come up, we often don't want to deal with them because it would mean something we would have to change, and we like the way things are, and we don't want to deal with it, and we don't want to be wrong. And that is in step with domination and control that stems from the doctrine of discovery. But again, we have so many things in our faith and practice that help us counter these. Oh, we have one more I wanted to talk about, which is we often confuse white norms for Quaker ways of being, or white supremacist culture for Quaker culture. And because Quakerism in this country grew up with white supremacy in this country, we haven't always done the work to tease out what of how we do and be actually comes from white norms and white supremacist culture, and what if we do and be is actually a Quaker way of being. And when we can separate those things out, we're going to have a fuller, richer version of Quakerism that is going to be more welcoming, inclusive, and holistic of all people, not just the people for whom it's most comfortable. And I think we're going going to find ourselves growing in numbers and in capacity when we start to do that work of teasing out white supremacist culture from actual Quaker culture. And so, as I said, we have so much that helps us counter this. And so these are just a few of the things that I go to when I'm feeling really stuck or overwhelmed in these patterns. And so the first is that all this is based on lies of separation and dehumanization, and that some people are more than and less than, right? And our original name for ourselves was publishers of the truth. So we believe in the truth, and we believe in the truth even when it is hard to hear. That consensus at its best, when it is done faithfully, never puts process over people and never conflates power with being right. And it allows underrepresented voices to be heard. It says that the majority should not rule, and that it forces us to listen to what is the truth God is calling us to. It's an incredibly powerful practice. That our commitment to simplicity, the way that I understand that helping us shed patterns of domination and control, is one in pushing away the ways in which materialism makes us complicit with many systems of domination and control in this country, but also in the way it invites us to get back into our bodies, to get back to spirit and God, and to center that. That our notion that ministry and eldering and the gifts of ministry and eldering can show up in different people and different times, and that together ministers hold up the truth and exhort us to what is right, and elders provide us with the guidance and coaching we need to live out that truth, to me is incredibly powerful. That at our core, we don't believe ministry and eldering is limited to one kind of people or even to a single person, that it is something each of us has the capacity to be gifted with at different times in our lives, and that the ability to speak truth and exhort us and provoke us, as the theme of sessions is, into the greater truth and love that God calls of us, and eldering being a vehicle to help us figure out how to do that and to call us back to that being, and that any of us can do that for each other, is incredibly powerful and breaks down all these lines of separation and domination and control. That our commitment to nonviolence is not just about not using weapons, but about not doing violence with our words and ways of being. And so again, at the core of our faith is a commitment to not engage in these systems of oppression. And all of our other testimonies support us working in ways that are about interdependence, that are about sharing of power, that are about connection. And so our faith has so much to offer us to counter these patterns of diversity and behaviors of oppression that many of us have learned and have brought into Quakerism. And then that third way that the doctrine of discovery has really infused our whole culture in this country around exploitation and about using and exploiting anybody and anything for the dominant's gain and executing it when it's no longer of value. There's numerous ways that this exploitation shows up in the world, and there are a myriad of ways that Friends are working to counter that exploitation. So I just want to name a few ways that within our yearly meeting, with Friends across the country and globally, and with many other denominations and groups of people, Friends are working to counter exploitation. So it's the Alternatives to Violence program, it's the work of the American Friends Service Committee, it's the work of the Friends Committee and National Legislature, it's the work of Quaker Earth Care Witness, the Quaker Initiative to End Torture, Friends World Committee for Consultation, the prison abolition work that Friends do, the work of the Racial, Social, and Economic Justice Committee, Challenging White Supremacy Working Group, the Reparations Working Group, the Prophetic Climate Action Working Group, all the work to become sanctuary communities and immigrant rights that Friends are doing, the justice work that's happening in Young Friends in junior high, in JYM, at Friends Camp through Youth Ministries. It's our commitment to the Poor People's Campaign. I am sure there are many, many, many more ways that Friends are collectively working to counter exploitation throughout New England, throughout our country, and around the world. I just wanted to highlight a few that New England Yearly Meeting is actively engaged in so we can see the myriad of ways that we're doing that work. But I also want us to look at some of the patterns of how exploitation shows up among us with each other. So whenever we are making decisions that are about hoarding resources or acting from a scarcity thinking place, that ties into that bigger pattern of exploitation, that there's not enough and I must get and claim. That I often experience having a culture of underappreciation, that we underappreciate our staff, and we underappreciate the many, many volunteers that make our yearly meetings and programs run. And the number of times I've talked to people who feel overwhelmed in their committee work, be it for the monthly meeting or the yearly meeting, and where we have forgotten to really appreciate and value people's time and labor and care and gifts, that's part of that exploitation culture. And then one of the other really big patterns that I see us doing around exploitation is the general expectation that friends who hold identity that's marginalized in society, so whether that is a friend of color, a friend who is transgender or genderqueer, a friend who is gay, lesbian, bisexual, or queer, a friend who is poor or working class, a friend who has a physical disability or other kind of disability, that we expect those friends to do education for the rest of us around whatever that issue is, and that's a form of exploitation. And so as we think about countering these patterns, we have to look at what's going on that allows us to hoard resources and have scarcity thinking, to maintain a culture of underappreciation, and to expect friends who live targeted by systems of oppression to do the work to teach the rest of us about those realities and what change needs to happen and where we can start to change and shift up those patterns. So again, if you are listening or watching this on your own or with another person, I invite you to consider these reflection questions. As you listen to this, what did you notice in your body? How are you feeling right now, physically, emotionally, energetically? What came up for you? Maybe you agreed with me, maybe you disagreed with me, maybe you had a strong reaction to something. Whatever it is, what came up for you? How do you see the patterns of separation, domination and control, and exploitation showing up in our society? I just named a few ways. There's many, many ways these patterns show up. So what are the ways you see them showing up among religious society of friends? And then 3, what are the Quaker tools, practices, and resources that you use to create connection, share power, and fully value all? I just named a few that I see and use. There's so many more, and I hope that this starts a conversation around what are all the things our rich and incredible faith tradition has to offer us in working for justice among ourselves and in the broader world. Thank you, friends.